what I was saying to them was like, just because someone has a record, so these people are coming into the program, they're not gonna tell you that because they're used to this stigma. So some general questions, say you do an intake, you get their information, and some questions that you ask everybody, you know, what are the biggest problems with your job search, and what are the biggest barriers to your employment? So that's like a general question where at that point some people will share, some people will not.
Yeah. So it sounded, we kind of broke it into two parts where it was like, in the beginning we're trying to establish like what the circumstances are that they're facing and give them an opportunity to talk about it. And then in the second half, it's like we're assuming that they've shared with us, but there might be a different set of questions if we still don't know about the record, but we know about a range of other barriers. So in the second half, so this is like assuming that we know.
Yeah. So basically asking, you know, what is their experience with employers, what's been difficult about finding a job with a record, and then these two questions are mainly not for us to give them a solution, but to just listen to what they're going through in that moment, not to be like, well, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Yeah.
So I think there are two elements to this that really stood out for me, and one is the timeline element, right? You're not going to have a person come into you and be like, well, I'm not getting a job because I'm a felon, or I did some jail time because of whatever. That's a significant vulnerability that requires time and trust in order to allow them to open up. And what was my second point? Oh, the second point was the kind of not black and white aspect of it, right? So Barbara really identified that a lot of these people who are coming into her who have records, they may not know, was their record expunged at the end of their jail time? Or, you know, what were their actual charges? What is it that's going to come up on a query? Like, so there's a lot of like kind of gray zone there, and their own knowledge and kind of understanding and ability to process and own that is really, it's not just kind of like Hollywood black and white. It's really kind of messy, and I think allowing them to talk about it in a safe space and tell their story might allow them to own it a little bit more and develop strategies for approaching employers and talking about it.
And I think there are practical steps you can take after, but anybody who comes in who has an issue with like finding a job, particularly if they have a big barrier like this, it's just about listening and acknowledging their experience, because a lot of people are like, why don't you have a job? I know someone who has a record and they have a job, why don't you have a job? And listening, and after this, maybe like problem posing, that's when you can move on to the practical things like finding out what their record is, and trying to help them coming up with a list of places that hire felons. So those are all practical solutions that you have, but maybe you might not do it kind of like in the cereals, the skits that you had this morning. You might not do it at the first, second, or third meeting. Be like after they've been able to express their issues.
We talked a little bit about initial questions and probing a little bit, and so we talked about just something as broad as like, so tell us about your children. What grades are they in? You know, what do they like? What school is it? And then maybe asking for an example of exactly like what's really bad, what is frustrating you so much.
And something that we talked about that we really liked in the second scenario that Penn did was to ask if other people in the room also experience this, or if their experience was different. So kind of gauging, finding the pattern, but also not assuming that this is a ubiquitous experience.
We also talked about suggesting parents who are going through situations help other parents who are going through similar or the same situation, just to like have that support there and.
Yeah, and we also talked about towing the line between asking parents to produce the solutions for us, or just explaining all of the resources to them without even seeing what they need. So trying to make it into more of an exchange and less of asking them what they want us to do, or just saying, here's all the things we can do, making it more of a conversation.
And then as one of the intro questions, since they were kind of coming to us to talk about the lack of quality, we wanted to ask them to brainstorm what quality would look like.
I think a question that came up in the quality of schools group that really like stuck with me was like, okay, so what does quality need to do? Because we talk about like the problems and all the things that are wrong with it, but like stepping aside from that, so like what does your ideal look like? And like let's work towards that too. And
Yeah, so drawing out vision.
Yeah, visioning.
Sorry, not to put words into your mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, because in some ways, like when we frame it as problem posing, then the logic of that is that we're really focusing on just sort of the negatives or the problems or what's going wrong, and that there can actually be a big part of it that's around drawing out people's vision, what they want to see.
Sometimes when you're doing problem posing, like from the other side, like you're the teacher, it's not that I don't want the students to, determine the cause of the problem in general and say that they can't do that, because some people can, but a lot of times it's a tool for me because I can be like, this person doesn't have a good perspective on their behavior. But I feel like that's probably not the intention, the way it's labeled here, right? That you're supposed to help this person, or by asking these questions that the person's gonna understand how they apply to them, they're gonna see the cause of the problem.
Right.
I just feel like my real life experience, that's not necessarily
Not the
true.
case.
I don't wanna be negative, I'm just.
Yeah, no, I mean, and part of what I hear and what you're saying is that sometimes asking people what the issues are isn't necessarily only about learning about the issues, but also what their perspective is on the issues, how they understand the problem. And then we have to make assessments based on that as a facilitator.
She was saying, in my job, I have to fill out this form, and this is how we get funded. And I think there are real barriers to operating from this perspective, from organizational perspectives that are maybe easier to overcome when you're kind of an organic group of parents coming together or neighbors who are trying to talk about a problem. But when we're, most of us, might work in an organization that have kind of procedures that are driven by, something. And so it might be worth thinking kind of just long-term, and maybe not in this class, but like, how do you use this, this thing to get at how you deliver your services in your organization, or how you address problem solving from the union perspective, or from SEC's perspective, or something.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, almost all of us were not going to find ourselves very frequently in situations where, we have no external constraints.
Yeah.
For that reason, like the pure vision or articulation of what popular education is definitely relies on sort of that assumption that we can really just allow people to solve their own problems and develop their own ideas. And in reality, a lot of us are working in organizations or institutions where there's certain kinds of constraints, and it's like that question of how do we hold those responsibly as a facilitator and think about how we can push those limits.
Some of the challenges are, I think, problem posing wouldn't be necessary if everyone had a very clear understanding of what the problem is and what the causes were, and therefore what the solutions are. And then, if that's the case, then you just gotta, fight for the solution. But I think there's so many issues that we all have to work on and that our communities are grappling with, where those causes aren't immediately apparent, or people blame themselves, right? Or people blame, they aren't looking for deeper causes necessarily. Like I'm thinking about the MBTA issue. Like when I was at ACE and we were working on a lot of this stuff and going out and talking to people, what we found was they were really pissed off at the drivers, the bus drivers, right? And there were certainly bad interactions and very, very obnoxious and rude bus drivers. But, how do you work with someone who's like, that's their perception of the problem to understand, well, what's the system that created that, right? And this is where it's tough because as an organizer or as a facilitator, you may have a point of view. And you may even think you have the right point of view. But, so there is that challenge. It's not just extracting what people think they know, but also challenging that too and, trying to go deeper, right? And then, so it's a difficult line to walk. Just the second issue to underline as well is that, this kind of process is one that, we set up, I think, 3 of the groups where they were groups. But then in the job seeking group, it was more like, an individual coming to you. So you can see how it applies in both, but the popular education approach certainly, I think what we're trying to say is that it's a collective effort, right? It is about people recognizing that this isn't just their problem, but that it's something that's shared, and therefore, there's a reason, that it's not just their own accountability and responsibility.